Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History with your host, Mr. Anchaski. I don't know what that accent was. Anyway, today we're going to continue Unit 7. We're going to talk about Chapter 7, which is all about East Asia and the mandate system in the Middle East. But your bell work is on the screen right now. You should identify and explain the results of the Paris Peace Conference for European, Asian, and African countries. So remember, the peace conference includes those different peace treaties made with places like Germany. We're going to see how the treaties impacted the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So consider stuff like that when you're answering the bell work right there. So this is going to be Chapter 7 of our 7th unit. So our 7th chapter of our 7th unit, all about East Asia and stuff going on in the Middle East through the mandate system. Lesson objective today: explain continuities and changes in territorial holdings from 1900 to the present. You should focus on East Asia and the Middle East. So let's first look at East Asia. Let's first look at events going on in China and Japan. We're going to focus first with Japan. But what's going on in Japan? Japan essentially is going to see this industrialization continue. We are going to see this economic tensions emerging in Japan, largely as a result of rapid industrialization. We're going to see the rise of mega corporations in Japan. These mega corporations, they are going to form conglomerates. And these corporate monopolies, essentially, that emerge are known as the zaibatsu. The zaibatsu are going to have an extremely firm hold over the Japanese economy. They are going to dictate a lot of this development that we will see in Japan. They especially really want natural resources because a lot of these zaibatsu, they are automobile industries. They are energy sectors, or economic conglomerates consumed with energy production. So the monopolies in Japan, they have almost a complete control over Japanese economy. They are not going to encourage labor unions. We don't really see a strong left wing in Japan. And as a result, we are going to see Japan be more susceptible to right-wing ideologies, but we'll talk about that more when we talk about the rise of authoritarianism in Japan. So these zaibatsu, they are going to have an almost economic stranglehold over the Japanese economy. They are going to largely contrast with the more traditional rural peasants that still remain in Japan. About 50% of Japanese people are peasants that live in the countryside. So we have these tensions forming. We have the lack of an significant left wing in Japan, and we also have an economic system that demands constant growth, especially growth for natural resources Japan does not have. And very similar to this economic tension between the working class and their factory owners, we are going to see cultural clashes as well. Remember, much of Japan is still rural. We have about 50% of Japanese peasants still living in the countryside. They are mostly going to remain traditional groups of people. And they are going to contrast with a largely westernized industrialist class that dominate the Japanese economy. This is going to include a lot of westernized figures in the middle class in Japan. So we are going to see this culture clash between those who favor westernization and those who want to remain traditional. And largely, this westernized middle class is going to make up the military in Japan. They're going to make up the private sector in the zaibatsu, and they're also going to make up government. And where are they getting their ideas of politics from? Well, concerningly, it is going to largely come from countries that are emerging with more authoritarian ideas of politics, like Germany and Italy. We are going to see the influence of fascism in Japan, especially among the Japanese middle class. On top of this, we are going to see the political implications of this need for natural resources but also the appeal towards Western-style authoritarian nationalism. And why is that? Well, there's going to be a rise in Japanese nationalism following the First World War. Let me turn off the screen behind me. Because of the fact that Japan is not going to get a lot of territory post-World War I. Remember, in the Treaty of Versailles, Japan largely not going to have significant territorial gains. So Japan is not going to gain much in the territory that it feels it deserves. It wanted land from the Germans. Sadly, the Japanese did not get that land. So there is going to be calls for aggressive military expansion in Japan, especially towards Japan's right next door neighbor, China. China is going to ramp up a very aggressive policy towards the Chinese. They are going to issue a series of demands of the Chinese government, 21 to be exact. They're called the 21 demands. Essentially, they are going to be a series of demands by the Japanese government to have exclusive trading rights in cities like Shanghai and Beijing, to have more access to natural resources for Japanese companies to expand into China, and also for more of a presence economically in places like Manchuria. So the need for resources is going to have a very aggressive foreign policy. Remember, Japan doesn't have much in the way of natural resources like oil or iron, so they have to get them either through trade with the US or by conquering new territories. Hopefully, they never start a war about this. So let's turn our attention to Japan's next door neighbor, because a lot of the events in Japanese foreign policy are going to impact developments within China. Well, let's go back. Let's rewind the clocks real quickly let's rewind the clocks. Sorry, I quote The Dark Knight a lot. I'm edgy. Anyway, we are going to see in China, by the end of the Qing dynasty in the early 20th century, a lot of economic and political problems. We're going to see increased tensions in Japan, or in China, by the start of the 20th century. For one thing, we don't really have industrialization in China. There's not going to be much economic prosperity. We have the constant presence of foreigners like Westerners, those from the United States and Europe, but also of Japanese political presence in China. So we have these problems of the late Qing dynasty. We have massive amounts of poverty, no industrialization, and we also have hostility by Westerners, or against Westerners. Sorry, I'm looking up the substitute teacher. He's a confused man. Anyway, we are going to see this hostility to the Western presence in China by the end of the Qing dynasty. And the Qing government is largely doing nothing in the way of encouraging industrialization or encouraging an end to poverty. So we are going to see this be a source of resentment, not only among China's peasants who don't want to, be poor anymore, but also of the members of the middle class in China. They want a liberal-style democratic system that encourages capitalism and industrialization. So all of these tensions are going to lead to a revolution in 1911, largely led by a westernized military class that seeks to industrialize China. So the westernized military is going to be a major force in conducting this revolution. They are going to successfully oust the emperor, I should say, of China, a guy by the name of Puyi. I'll talk about him more in a second. But the revolution is going to have the overall goal of establishing a liberal republic in China, one that encourages capitalism. And one of these figures that is going to lead the political revolution is a guy by the name of Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen was a Hong Kong born, Western trained, Western educated member of the Chinese middle class. He is going to be highly westernized. And he's one of these major figures in leading the revolution of 1911. He is going to have a very weird political ideology, one that combines different ideas in China, ideas like socialism, ideas like liberalism, especially political liberalism. He's combining Chinese values like Confucianism. But overall, Sun is a nationalist. He wants to expel the European and Japanese presence in China. And he also is a bit of an ethno-nationalist. He favors the unified vision of Chinese ethnicity. Whereas China has different ethnic groups, he is in favor of kind of having a single Chinese national identity. So he's going to seek a lot of cohesion in his political system that forms after the 1911 revolution, when the Chinese Republic is established. He's going to be president. He's going to try and find compromises between the different visions of what China should be like. He's largely the figure, the glue, you could say, keeping together China, keeping together the early Chinese Republic. And yet when the Republic is established under our boy Sun Yat-sen, it is going to be a very shaky one. And yet there are going to be some successes of this Chinese Republic. We are going to see for the first time a liberal democracy put in place in China. We are going to see a new social mobility emerge as a result of the decline of the nobility. We are going to see more middle-class people in China. And to a degree, we are also seeing ethnic unity in the Chinese Republic, and that's exemplified through the Chinese Republic's flag right here. It represents the different ethnicities of China. You have the Han Chinese, you have the Manchu, we have the Manchu, we have the Mongols, the Hui, they're a group of Muslim Chinese people in the western part of the country, and also Tibetans. So the Chinese Republic is a multi-ethnic society, one that is a liberal democracy. And yet we have a lot of factions in China. We have factions like people from the old Qing dynasty. They want to retain absolute power in China. And one of those figures is a general by the name of Yuan Shikai. Yuan is a Chinese noble. He is a military leader that helped the Chinese Revolution. But he doesn't want to give up his power as a noble to some liberal democracy. So Yuan is going to lead a military coup against Sun and is going to establish China as a dictatorship, essentially. It's still called the Chinese Republic, but under the authority of its president, its new president Yuan, we are going to see a dictatorship emerging. And we are going to see resistance to this dictatorship, especially by the ousted president Sun Yat-sen. Sun is going to form an opposition party to the dictatorship of Yuan, and this party is going to be the Guomindang. The Guomindang is a Chinese nationalist party, but very much like Sun, it is a mixture of different political ideologies. It is what we would call a big tent party. It includes a left wing. Let me draw this on the screen real quick, actually. Doodly 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 doo. So it encouraged, is there a text? Awesome. So on the left wing of the Guomindang Party, we have socialists. In the middle, we have liberals. And what do liberals like? They like capitalism. Let me move that over. Can I move it? Oh, heck yeah. And then on the right wing, we are going to have extreme ethno-nationalists. They are in favor of authoritarianism. So the Guomindang Party right now is basically anyone who is a Chinese nationalist that doesn't like the Yuan presidency. So Sun forms this very loose coalition of different political ideologies in the nationalist Guomindang Party. And the Guomindang Party is going to be comprised of different factions, as I've been saying, and it is going to, as we'll see later on, break up. And the thing keeping them together is Chinese nationalism, but also ideas of son being a compromising moderate figure. So under the presidency of Yuan, we are going to see some changes in China. Of course, we see the establishment of dictatorship. But China is also going to get involved in the First World War. We are going to see China get involved in the conflict on the side of the Allies. And why is that? Well, the Chinese, they want to eliminate the presence of foreigners in China. They want to decrease those spheres of influence. So the Germans are going to be the main target of Chinese resentment because they seem like the power that's going to lose. Remember, the British were the ones that exploited China the most. And why would they get on the same side as the British? Well, much like how the colonies were promised independence in Africa and Asia, China's not going to get any promises explicitly of spheres of influence going away. But there's an overall feeling in China that, hey, if we help them now, then we can kill two birds with one stone. We'll get rid of at least one of the European powers, the Germans, and we'll also get rid of the Allies. If we buddy up to them, if we cooperate, maybe they'll leave. So nationalists are going to generally support the First World War. And yet there are going to be a lot of problems within China, especially under the Yuan presidency. We are going to see a very unpopular dictatorship. Yuan suspends parliament. He suspends the Chinese Republican government. He's going to suspend a lot of liberal political freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of the assembly, freedom of press, all those wonderful First Amendment things. And yet, at the same time, we are going to see the factionalism emerge in Yuan's presidency. He is going to allow for the rise of the warlord class in China. These warlords are going to divide up China into different regions. These different regions are really going to act as their own independent territories, not really listening to Yuan. So it's going to encourage further decentralization in China under the unpopularity of the Yuan presidency. We are going to see the rise of warlords. I have to get rid of that. All right. No, stop. You know what? You would think I'd be technologically savvy. Anyway. So what is going to develop after the First World War? Well, before the end of the war, we are going to see the rise of a period of Chinese history where there is a stark political division. We are going to see resisting the unpopular presidency of Yuan. At one point, he calls himself Emperor of China, and like, dude, that's not a good look in a post-revolutionary society. So we are going to see warlords breaking away from China. They're not independent as their own countries per se, but they aren't really listening to Yuan's presidency. We are seeing a period of political strife in China known as the warlord era. And we are seeing different forms of resistance to this to the presidency of Yuan. We are going to see the Guomindang Party emerge. We are going to see liberals, and we'll talk about them more in a second. And yet we're also going to see the rise of the Communist Party in the 1920s. So the Yuan presidency, very unstable. It's leading to different factions vying for power in China. And one of those factions is going to be a very liberal, pro-democracy, pro-capitalism movement called the May 4th movement. The May 4th movement essentially is a collection of university students, of nationalists who are liberals, who want to establish China's full economic and political independence. They're largely going to resist the Treaty of Versailles. They don't like the fact that the Germans were the only ones that left China. They are upset that the French, the British, and the Americans, they still have spheres of influence in China. They're still upset that the Japanese have a presence in China. So the May 4th movement, largely composed of liberals, is going to see a movement that advocates for a liberal democracy. They want to return China to being a real republic, one with a president rather than an emperor. They want to unify China politically by having a very strong national military, get rid of the landlords, or well, get rid of the warlords. And they also want the Japanese to leave China. And we are going to see political unification largely through the Northern Expedition. The Guomindang Party is going to lead a military expedition to unify China under one rule, under the Nationalist Party. And in the Guomindang Party, we are going to see a split emerge between those three different factions, between the left, the moderates, and the right. We are going to see the co-option of this May 4th movement, this pro-capitalist movement in the Guomindang Party. And we are going to see a very close alliance between the right and the liberals in the Guomindang Party. And that is going to be especially clear after the death of Sun Yat-sen. Sun is going to die, unfortunately, and his successor is going to be the military commander of the Guomindang Party. It is going to be Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang is a Chinese nationalist, but he's also very much inspired by Mussolini, by Italian fascism. So he is going to alienate the left wing of the Guomindang Party. Different socialist groups will emerge when they break off from the Guomindang. One of those groups is the Communist Party, but we'll talk about them in a second. And Chiang Kai-shek is going to successfully unify China and end the warlord era. He is going to establish a unified Chinese republic. The problem is, it's going to be a dictatorship. So even though Chiang Kai-shek is going to establish political unity, even though he is going to promote a lot of institutions like labor unions and peasant associations, he is going to be a dictator. He is suspending a lot of liberal democracy that the liberals wanted. He's favoring capitalism, sure. And at the same time, he is doing little to solve issues of economic class distinctions. He is doing little to solve issues of poverty. So nationalist China is going to be a period of history in the Chinese Republic, where we have a lot of political instability and where we are going to see the grounds for the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, of Chinese Marxism. So the rise of Chinese Marxism is largely going to be a reaction against the right-wing turn of the Guomindang Party. And largely, we're going to see that idea emerge with the figure of Li Daocao. Li is a Chinese intellectual. He is a middle-class guy, but he is very much going to be inspired by more left-leaning ideas. He is at first a liberal, but he's really scared, or not scared. He is skeptical of the authoritarian right wing of the Chinese Guomindang Party. So Li is going to break away from the Guomindang. He is going to form his own political association that will become the Communist Party. And the lights have switched off because God hates me. There we go. But what is Li going to think about in terms of Chinese communism? Because much like Lenin, he is going to recognize that China is not an industrialized country. So Li is going to have to make his own interpretation of Marxism. So Li is going to start out by recognizing that the Chinese don't have an industrial working class. Remember, Marx was all about we need those transitions into different stages of socialism and communism, but we need industrial capitalism. But China doesn't have an industrial working class. So according to orthodox Marxism, China could never have a communist revolution. They need to undergo industrialization. But how is Li going to work around this? Well, much like Lenin, Li is going to say, we could have a communist revolution now because, and here's where he is distinct from Lenin, we already have class conflict in China. That class conflict It still is that kind of general proletariat v bourgeoisie, but we have different groups of people who make that up. According to Marx, the proletariat is the industrial working class. According to Lenin, the proletariat doesn't exist in Russia. So they can't organize a revolution. Same thing in China. There is no industrial working class to speak of. So Li is going to say that class conflict in China is largely a division between the peasants, who are going to be the Chinese proletariat in Li's case, against the West and those who have westernized in China. So China already has class conflict. That's enough, according to Li, for a communist revolution. We don't need to worry about industrialization the same way that Leninism or Stalinism is. And who is going to be this vanguard party? Because that is a similarity with Marxist-Leninism. And according to Li, that has to be through a vanguard party. There needs to be a highly organized political institution to lead the communist revolution. And while Lenin is going to say that's the more educated members of the professional working class, Li is going to say that the vanguard party has to be made up of peasants. There's a degree that peasants have to be involved in the communist state. And Li doesn't really care about industrialization all that much. It will happen, sure, eventually, who cares? But it's not a major focus of Chinese Marxism under Li. So Li is going to organize a political party, the Communist Party of China, and it's going to have a platform that is going to be very popular among Chinese peasants. It's going to offer social reforms, such as eliminating class distinctions. It is going to provide social welfare for impoverished farmers. But Li is not going to say that this is going to be done through democratic means. We need to have an authoritarian leader. We need to have a strong state to guide the people into communism, into a eventual communist classless society. Li is going to have a few famous students, and one of them is going to be Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, of course, will be the leader of the Communist Party eventually. And he is going to lead to the successful Chinese Revolution in 1949, but we will talk about that later. And just to make this kind of complicated, this is what Li interprets as the class struggle, as the eventual struggle into capitalism. Well, largely, China has not industrialized. So it cannot really jump from this pre-industrial feudal state to the industrial capitalist conflict right here. So Li is going to reorganize this class conflict definition for China. He's going to reinterpret it. It's going to be this distinction between the West, who's oppressing China, and the peasant and largely small industrial working class in China. And it's going to be this peasant vanguard party that leads a socialist revolution, finally establishes a classless society. So we don't need all the peasants, just all of the vanguard party to lead the people in their best interest. So you should be able to identify a weakness and a strength of the Chinese Republic. Let's switch gears to the Near East. We talked about the Far East. Let's talk about the Middle East. Let's talk about the Near East, as it's sometimes called. We'll talk about the mandate system. So what is the mandate system? Well, if you'll forgive me, let's do a little time trip. Let's do the time warp again. So during the Paris Peace Conference, during the Treaty of Versailles, remember Wilson had his 14 points. And one of those 14 points was ending colonialism. It was granting self-determination to colonial subjects in Africa and Asia. And remember, Great Britain and France, they promised independence to these countries anyway. So it's in everyone's best interest to have this end of colonialism, of end of imperialism. And yet, Great Britain and France, as we'll see more in our next presentation, they are largely struggling to rebuild their economies. We are going to see a drive for these countries to retain their colonies. They're especially going to be interested in acquiring German territory and Ottoman territory. But a compromise needs to be reached between the different allies. We are going to see that, and that is going to be in the mandate system. Essentially, the mandate system is kind of offered as a way to transition some colonies into independence. There is going to be a division of the world into mandatories, European countries for the most part, and mandates, the colonies. So the mandatories are expected to politically advise and economically advise these countries to develop industrially and liberally in terms of their democratic politics. And yet it's going to divide the world into different stages, into different classes of these mandates. In the Class C mandates, we are going to see a lot of former German territories remain colonies of Europe. We are going to see the continuation of colonies in smaller undeveloped countries like Namibia in Southwest Africa, right here, former German territory. It is going to be operated by the South African government, a proxy colony of the British. In Class B societies, these are more populated, more densely urbanized, and somewhat industrialized countries. They have a degree of development. They are going to be supervised by a council on the League of Nations. Remember, the League of Nations, international cooperative body seeking to prevent World War II, seeking to prevent future conflict, I should say. So Class B colonies, again, mostly in Africa, mostly supervised by League of Nation powers like the British, like the Belgians, like the French, like the Japanese. So this is going to be a lot in Southeast Asia, a lot in places like the Middle East, in Africa, not the Middle East. And then finally, we have Class A mandates. Class A mandates, they are going to be technically given their freedom. They're going to be technically given their independence. And yet the vague wording of the Class A mandates, let me read how vague this language is, because it will absolutely blow your mind. It is going to allow a continued European and economic presence in these technically independent countries. So let me read to you the wonderful wording of the League of Nations as it relates to these Class A mandates. Well, the Class A mandates are going to be described by the League of Nations as having reached a stage of development where their existence as an independent nation can be provisionally recognized subject to the rendering of administrative advice and assistance by a mandatory until such time as they are able to stand on alone. The wishes of these communities must be a principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory. What the absolute heck does that mean? Well, it's very ambiguous. So even though technically these countries are independent, it's more accurate to call them, one second, a little bit of a joke right here. They're independent, not really independent. We are going to see continued military occupation of Class A mandates around the Middle East. And again, it's mostly going to be territory that was former Ottoman controls. We are going to see this mandate system mostly in former Ottoman territory. And we are going to see a continued economic and political presence of Europe in former countries of the Ottoman Empire. And in reaction to the presence of European military and economic presence, even though they were promised independence, we are going to see the rise of nationalism to resist European military occupation. This is going to be kind of a general theme across North Africa and the Middle East. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment, actually. I'll try to answer them because you're not the only one who has that question. So let's first look at a place that is not going to be a mandate, that is not going to have a European presence, largely through the success of Turkish nationalism, and that is, as you can expect, Turkey. Remember, by the end of the First World War, we are going to see the Ottoman Empire basically fall apart. But how does Turkey emerge? Well, let's go back to the end of World War I. When the Ottomans finally surrender, we are going to have an occupation of its capital, Istanbul, by a combined force of the Allies. We have the French, the British, Italians, Greek people. And they are all going to occupy parts of Anatolia and Istanbul. And this is going to be met by Turkish nationalism. We are going to see the rise of a certain guy by the name of Mustafa Kemal. Kemal is a Turkish nationalist. He wants to expel the European presence, the Allied presence in Turkey. So he's going to lead a military campaign comprised of his nationalist former Young Turk Party to drive out the Allies and the war of Turkish independence. And Kemal is going to establish a firmly independent Turkey. He is going to secure that independence by westernizing, modernizing Turkey. He's going to do a few things in terms of the political structure. Again, overall intent is to prevent invasion by the West. So he is going to introduce a lot of reforms to encourage capitalism. He's encouraging European laws, ideas of freedom of speech, of republican government. We are going to see the imposition of a Christian calendar in Turkey, the secularization of things like politics and society. We are going to see very radical changes under Kemal. We are going to see the Turkish language itself lose its Arabic script. It's becoming Latin script. It is going to also see the westernization, the modernization of gender roles in Turkey. We are going to see a lot of social and political equality being granted for women. They have legal rights, if not cultural rights. And we are going to see an overall campaign of westernization largely succeed. And to attribute this position of modernizing Turkey so successfully, Kemal is also known as Ataturk, the father of the Turks. I like that word because it sounds like attaboy, but it's Ataturk. Anyway, we are going to see the rise of Ataturk, and thus we are going to see the creation of a fairly liberal republic in Turkey. What's going on elsewhere in the Middle East? Let's talk about the Maghrib. Let's talk about Northwest Africa. So in places like Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, these are going to be places controlled by the French. They are given a degree of self-rule following the First World War. But it is going to be an area where we see deep resentment of the mandate system. We are going to see a lot of political unrest in Northwest Africa against the continued French military and economic presence. And we are going to see the rise of Arab and Berber nationalism in Northwest Africa. We are going to see the rise of a middle class in this part of the world. And what is this middle class getting wealthy on? It's getting wealthy through a wonderful new commodity everybody wants and loves: oil, petroleum. So we are going to see, as a result of this changing economic focus, the rise of a middle class in the Maghrib. We are going to see a population explosion in Northwest Africa. We are going to see a massive change in, oh my God, excuse me. We are going to see a rise of a westernized middle class, a merchant class, who have adopted not only Western ideas of society and culture, but also Western ideas of nationalism. So among this new middle class, we are seeing the rise of nationalism, of Berber and Arab nationalism. And largely this nationalism is directed against the French. The French have a continued military presence in Northwest Africa. We have French settlers seeking to cash in on the North African oil business. And we're also seeing the rise of French political presence by these French settlers in the governments of these colonies. So essentially, white settlers dominate major positions across the North African area of North Africa, the North African area of North Africa. So we are going to see French presence in the colonial governments of Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and there's little presence in the higher echelons of government of Arabs or Berbers. So this is going to contribute to overall feelings of nationalism across Northwest Africa. We are going to see a lot of resentment of the French in Northwest Africa, especially among poorer Arabs and Berbers that haven't made it into the middle class. So nationalism is going to be kind of a multi-class movement. It is going to be one that comprises the interests of middle-class people and working-class peasants. Well, working-class people and peasants, they're distinct. Let's look at an area where we are going to see heavy resistance to the mandate system. A lot of tensions as a result of the mandate system is how I should phrase that. So we are going to see the formal division of the Middle East, largely even before the war was won. We are going to see kind of actual implementation of this Eastern question in the Middle East, in the former Ottoman Empire. During the war, the British and the French, they're going to divide up the territories of the Ottoman Empire in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And this Sykes-Picot Agreement that divided the Middle East between the French and the British is going to make its way in the League of Nations mandate when this area is designated as a Class A mandate. And who is going to guide and supervise the transition of these Class A mandates into independence? Well, it's going to be the French and the British. The British are going to, or let's start with the French because they're least important today. The French are going to have a presence in Syria and Lebanon. They are mostly going to be interested in conducting a military presence there. And we see similar reactions against the French presence, much like we did in Northwest Africa. So really, we're not going to talk about it all that much. We are mostly going to focus on Iraq and Palestine. Remember, during the Great War, during the First World War, the Ottomans were largely going to be broke apart by these ethnic nationalist movements, by the Arab movement, for example, the Arab revolts. The British are going to fund this effort to resist the Ottomans and also to gain a foothold in terms of influence in the post-war period. So in Iraq, we are going to see the successful creation of an Iraqi independent system, an independent country under King Faisal I, the leader of the Arab revolts. But we are going to see, despite this independence, a lot of military presence in Iraq by the British. Iraq is going to not really see the removal of this British presence until really the 1940s, 1950s. So Iraq is going to be dominated by British military troops. They are going to serve as the protectors of Iraq. And at the same time, we're going to have British economic interests also making their way to Iraq because Iraq has the same precious commodity utilized for industrialization, oil. So we are going to see a continued presence of Britain in Iraq through the mandate system, largely to make sure Britain has access to everyone's favorite viscous liquid oil. Let's talk about another area where we will see tensions, and that is going to be in the mandate of Palestine. Remember, Palestine is a region of the Middle East that was largely going to be comprised of different groups like Arabs and Arab Christian Muslims, of Arab Christians and Arab Muslims. There's also a presence of Jews there as well. but to encourage the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and to encourage British military presence and economic presence, we are going to see the continuation of British presence in Palestine, even though they promised these Palestinian Arabs independence post-war Middle East. But the British are also making promises to Jews. They are making promises to Zionists. So Zionism, again, is that idea that we should have a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state in the Middle East, in the traditional area that is known as Israel. And Zionism is emerging largely as a reaction against anti-Semitism emerging in Europe. We have things like the Dreyfus Affair. There's a guy by the name of Dreyfus, Alfred Dreyfus. He is a Jewish French military officer who's accused of treason, of helping the Germans on very shaky ground. He probably didn't do it, but it's going to be viewed by Jews in Europe as an example of state anti-Semitism. So under the direction of guys like Theodor Herzl, we should just leave Europe. We should set up a presence in Palestine. And the British government is going to formally recognize a promise for a Jewish state in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration. And again, it is declared to break up the Ottoman Empire. And yet, the British made promises to two groups of people, the Jews to have a Jewish homeland, but also Arabs in Palestine, Palestinian Arabs. They promised that if they cooperated, if they led this Arab revolt, then there would be not much of these restrictions on Palestinian Arabs, if there would be independence afterwards. And yet the British really promised both sides. They are going to alienate both of them through having conflicting policies that seem to contradict one another. And we are going to see the mass importation, the mass settling of Jews in Palestine, largely at the expense of Palestinian Arabs. So we are going to see kind of unpopularity on both sides of the British mandate system. The Israeli Jews, or I'm getting ahead of myself, Palestinian Jews are largely against the presence of the British military in Palestine. They're also resentful of the fact that the British have outlawed and restrict a lot of Jewish settlement in Zion, in Palestine, I should say. And the Arabs are mad because their land is being taken away from them. We'll talk more about kind of this land grab when we talk about the creation of Israel at the end of this unit. But needless to say, we have tensions as a result of these dual promises given by the British to different groups in the Middle East. Hopefully that doesn't cause problems today. Hopefully there is no Jewish Arab kind of class conflict, ethnic conflict in places like, Israel or Palestine. There is. Let's turn our attention to a country that is going to achieve its independence and yet is still going to have a significant British presence. And that is going to be Egypt. What happens in Egypt? Well, Egypt is largely going to be a British protectorate ever since the so-called Arabi Revolt in 1882. So Egypt is going to be regarded as a protectorate of the British Empire. Egypt is technically independent, and yet it is going to largely be dominated by the British military. The British military, remember, they want to control key areas in Egypt like the Suez Canal. They want to control major Egyptian economic areas like the cotton industry. So to protect these industries, we are going to see British troops being sent to Egypt. We are going to see troops occupying the Suez Canal. We are going to see troops occupying key cotton plantations. And the overall resistance to the military presence in Egypt is going to lead to a rise in nationalism. We should be in Egypt free of all Western influence here. And we're also going to see tensions emerge between the British and the Egyptians in things like the Dinshawe incident. This is essentially going to be a incident in 1906. You don't need to know exactly word for word what happens, but it is going to be an incident where British officers are going to hunt pigeons grown by the village of Dishinawe. These are going to be villagers who depend on pigeons for food, but the officers are hunting them for sport. What jerks. So we are going to see these villagers try and stop the officers. A fight is going to break out. A gun is shot from the officer's side and kills the wife of the local imam, the Muslim cleric. And this is going to enrage an entire village to attack the British officers. One of the officers runs away. He dies of heat stroke in the Egyptian desert. The Egyptians go and try to help him. But when the British hear about this fight that broke out, they are going to send more troops into Dishawe. And what do they see? They see basically villagers holding and caring for a dead body. So obviously the British are going to say, you guys killed this guy, what the heck? So there's going to be mass reprisals against the Egyptians in the Dishawe incident. They are going to be absolutely tried and convicted of their questionable guilt. Some will be executed for the death, quote unquote, of an officer for killing that officer. Some are given life sentences. Some are going to be given floggings or whippings in the streets. And this is going to be a major break between the British and the local Egyptians. We are going to see more open revolts against liberal rule in Egypt. We are going to see in 1913, Britain eventually giving in to pressures to give them political representation. And this is going to reveal an already tense relationship between the British and Egyptians. It's leading to increased Egyptian nationalism. Generally, the theme of this presentation is Europe doesn't respect the interests of these countries. They send in military troops. Military troops are unpopular. That leads to nationalism. And there are going to be even more British troops as a result of the First World War. We are going to see a lot of British troops present in Egypt, largely to defend the Suez Canal by the Ottomans. So we have these feelings of nationalism emerging. We are going to finally see that break down come up in the Revolution of 1919. In 1919, Egypt is not going to be present at the Paris Peace Conference. We are going to see this presence not there in the Paris Peace Conference of local Egyptians. So we are going to see a revolt in Egypt against the British military occupation. We are going to see the rise of the Guomindang Party. This is a liberal nationalist organization aiming to establish full Egyptian independence. And they are going to be successful. They are going to lead a true nationalist revolution, and they are going to say, hey, Britain, get out of Egypt. They are going to see a parliamentary government established under King Farouk. And yet, it's important to remember that the British still run certain key aspects of an independent Egypt. Britain recognizes Egyptian independence in 1922, but guess who still owns the Suez Canal? It's the British. Guess who still has an alliance with the British? It's the King of Egypt, Farouk. So Farouk is still going to have close political connections with the deeply unpopular British. He's allowing them to have the Suez Canal. So we are going to see a general feeling of anti-British resistance. And this is going to contribute to even more nationalism, even though Egypt is technically independent. So you should be able to define the mandate system. You should also be able to define how it's leading to tension within the Middle East. So that is all I have today. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed that presentation. Hope you got caught up on notes. Hope you are doing well. And I also am very interested in hearing how much homework you are doing for this class. I want you to send me an email if you've watched all the way through. Please send me an email. I appreciate the data. How many hours are you spending on homework for AP World History? Thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of the day. Oh, shoot, I forgot to do that. Oh, well, stop recording.